The clasp was already in her hand when the guard stepped forward, warm metal, edges worn smooth, a dead woman's weight she had carried onto 4 ships. Pelen Orun watched from the observer gallery, her fingers still. She had attended 31 proceedings in this hall. She had never once seen what she was watching now. Commander General Sola Ademiran of Earth's Diplomatic Expeditionary Corps did not stop walking. The guards had moved to intercept, and she had simply continued at the same pace as if they were furniture she had already accounted for. The clasp stayed in her left hand. It had been there since the corridor. 14,000 names. That was the number Arun kept returning to, even then, even before the strike. 19 years of a file that no one in this room knew existed, and 14,000 dead people who were the reason it had been opened at all. The tribunal clearinghouses had frozen 6 hours ago, all 11 of them. Orun pressed her left secondary thumb against the seam of her robe and held it there. The part that still keeps me up at night, she already knew exactly how this ended. Stay close. The convocation hall of the Vethal sovereignty had been built to make visitors feel small. Orun had understood this the first time she had entered it 40 years ago and had adjusted. Most species never did. The ceiling ran 38 meters overhead. The floor was pale Vethal limestone, polished until it reflected the lights that had been set into the ground rather than the walls, a deliberate choice, because upward-angled light catches under a face and pulls the shadows wrong, and the architects had known this and had done it anyway. The foreign delegation platform sat 22 centimeters below the main chamber grade, not enough to step down onto, just enough to notice. Ademiran stood on the lowered platform and looked like someone who had already measured everything. She was 63 years old, Ghanaian Scottish. Her left cheekbone would fracture in approximately 4 minutes. Her right hand rested flat against her thigh, which Orun would later learn was what she did when she was thinking, and she had been doing it since she crossed the threshold. Archconvener Thurak Ven occupied the raised central seat. 2.3 meters, pale gray-green scaled hide, 6-fingered hands splayed flat on the arms of the chair in the formal declaration posture. The ceremonial collar of hammered mineral plates sat around his neck, worn only for humiliation rites, Orun had been told. She had not known that the first time she saw it. She had looked it up afterward. He had presided over 31 denial hearings. He had never once granted standing to a petitioner who was not Vethal. The petition before him today concerned corridor access for 2.3 billion people. He did not allow Ademiran to speak. No response, no deliberation, no pause. The denial came in 40 seconds. The ritual strike order came at 41. One of Thurak Ven's attendants crossed the floor and hit her across the left side of her face with the back of a ceremonial plate. The campaign clasp rang on pale stone. The gallery of 4,000 witnesses, 31 species, 7 media relay drones, 1 senior compact observer who had read a classified brief 9 years earlier and said nothing, went completely silent. Ademiran went down on one knee. She was back on her feet in 2 seconds. She reached down and picked up the clasp. She put it in her left breast pocket. She looked at Thurak Ven for 4 seconds. Then she walked out. Her aide fell into step behind her, exactly 1 pace back, as if they had rehearsed this. Nobody spoke, not one of the 4,000. Orun pressed her secondary thumb harder against the robe seam and thought, there it is. 6 hours and 40 minutes earlier and 300,000 kilometers away, the UES Caravel Meridian smelled like recycled air and tea. The galley was small. Most things on escort vessels were small. The table had room for 4 people if they were friendly about their elbows, and Ademiran sat at one end of it with a medic working on her face and a ceramic mug in both hands. The mug was deep blue. The glaze was hand-applied and slightly uneven near the rim, the way things are when someone makes them in a school ceramics class and fires them themselves and gets the kiln temperature a little wrong. The base had a hairline crack running left to right about 4 centimeters. The letters on the side read "World's Most Acceptable Mum," written in black slip in a child's uneven hand. Ademiran held it with the text facing inward. She had stopped reading it years ago. It was just there the way a heartbeat is there. Her daughter had made it in 2394, fired it wrong, sent it anyway. It had been on 4 ships in 14 years. It had been present at the Havath hearings, the Drell corridor closure, and 3 meetings that had gone badly enough to be classified. It had never made any of those things easier. It had simply been there, which was, Arun would come to understand, its own kind of argument. The medic finished taping the cheekbone. He closed his kit. Ademiran finished her tea. She set the mug down. She looked at the communications panel on the wall. Then she reached over and opened a channel to Earth Strategic Command. The call lasted 38 seconds. She said 3 words, "Initiate the Shepherd." She closed the channel. The medic picked up his kit and left. She sat alone in the galley for a moment, both hands still on the table, right hand flat, and then she stood up and went to her quarters. Arun should explain at this point why she knows any of this. She was not on the Caravel Meridian. She was still in the Convocation Hall observer gallery when a Demiren walked out, watching Thurak Ven's attendants begin the formal close of proceedings as if nothing had happened that would matter. She would not speak to a Demiren directly for 11 more days. What Arun knew, what she had known for 9 years in a way that had kept her awake on more than one occasion, was that she had read the Long Patience operational brief in 2399, under seal in her capacity as archive liaison to the Compact Tribunal's Classified Records Division. She had read it, she had said nothing. She had filed it where it was supposed to go, under a reference number that would not be easily found, and she had waited. She had waited because the brief was not a threat, it was not a plan for war. It was not an act of aggression by any measure she had ever been trained to identify. It was a file opened by Earth's Strategic Preparedness Division in 2389, the week after 14,000 colonists died, that contained no weapons budget, no fleet allocation, and no demands. It contained only a mandate: watch, document, and wait for the moment the sovereignty's own foundation becomes the instrument. Arun had filed it, she had gone home, she had spent 9 years not being sure if that moment would ever come. And then Thurak Ven had ordered the strike. The Havath supply denial happened in November of 2389. A colony of 43,000 people on Havath Station depended on the Vethal sovereignty's food brokerage network for 80% of their caloric supply. This was not unusual. 14 species were in similar positions by design. The sovereignty had spent 60 years building a network in which dependency was the point, and the dependency had worked exactly as intended. What happened in November of 2389 was that Earth submitted a formal petition for expanded corridor access in the Kepler sector. The petition was legal. It was filed through the correct channels. It asked for nothing the sovereignty was not authorized to grant. The sovereignty did not respond to the petition. 3 weeks later, the Havath Station supply route was reclassified as a low-priority corridor. This was an administrative designation. It was not, technically, a denial. It resulted in 14,000 people dying before the supply chain could be rerouted. Earth filed a formal protest. The sovereignty did not respond to that either. Ambassador Senna Marshakafer had worked the Havath emergency personally. She had been on station during the last 3 weeks trying to coordinate alternative routes, watching the numbers go down. She was British Kenyan, 60 years old at the time, and she had spent 30 years in diplomatic service, believing that institutions could be used by people who understood them well enough. The week the final count came through, she sat down and wrote a proposal, 3 pages, longhand on paper, because she did not trust the sovereignty's passive signals monitoring of digital traffic, a precaution that 19 years later would be one of the reasons the operation had never been detected. She called it Operation Long Patience. No weapons, no fleet, no timeline, just a mandate: find the structural vulnerabilities that the sovereignty had never bothered to protect because it had never believed anyone would look. 14,000 people, 14,000 names, 14,000 reasons. Earth's Strategic Preparedness Division approved the proposal the same week. The funding was classified under Infrastructure Review, a budget line that had existed for 40 years and attracted no scrutiny. 7 positions were opened under civilian cover across the sovereignty's economic and archival infrastructure. The positions were filled over the following 18 months. Marshakafer herself took a posting as external coordinator, officially retired from active diplomatic service, working from a quiet office on Luna. She had 19 years to wait. She was 60 years old. She intended to be there for every one of them. The team was small enough to remember. Commander Isak Farathkal was the tactical lead, Swedish-born, 46, a man who had never once been photographed in uniform. He spoke in complete sentences and never more than 2 of them at a time. His job was to know where everything was and what it connected to. Dr. Sen Kaldrava was the legal specialist, Malian French, 54, who had memorized every article of the Galactic Compact in 4 languages and could cite subsections the way other people cited addresses. Her voice was the flattest thing Arun had ever heard, not cold, just stripped of anything that wasn't the point. Sergeant Junko Farath handled intelligence. Japanese-Brazilian, 40. She had spent 6 years before the operation learning Tilhari oral memory technique from an elder on a research posting, because Marshakafer's brief had identified the Tilhari as the most likely first co-signatory if a moment ever came, and Farath had simply decided to become someone a Tilhari elder might trust. Chief Engineer Pavel Norek ran infrastructure and economic systems. Czech Kenyan, 51. He had taken a maintenance contractor position on 3 separate sovereignty supply platforms and had spent a decade building a map of exactly which supply lines were redundant and which ones weren't. Agent Soven Rail was the embedded archivist. Russian-born, 43. She had worked in the sovereignty's own administrative records division for 11 years under a civilian identity so unremarkable that 3 separate internal security reviews had passed over her file without comment. She had never accessed a single classified document. She had not needed to. Comms specialist Tamaz Vale was 35, Colombian Ghanaian, and had the particular gift of being exactly as memorable as he wanted to be, which in most operational contexts was not at all. And Marsha Keffer herself on Luna, running nothing officially and everything actually, making coffee in a quiet room and reading reports that arrived through channels too old-fashioned to monitor. The Haveth supply denial killed 14,000 people. Earth filed a protest. The sovereignty did not respond. Operation Long Patience opened that same week. Marsha Keffer's original brief was 3 pages. The final operational archive, delivered to the tribunal 19 years later, was 6,900 pages. Every page had been written in anticipation of a moment exactly like the one that was now happening. The sovereignty had, in Orun's considered estimation, made a number of reasonable assumptions about the state of the galaxy that had all been correct until this week. The first was that they controlled the food. The Vethal did not produce food, they never had. What they produced was access to the brokerage networks, the transit licenses, the clearinghouse credits that allowed food to move between the species that grew it and the species that needed it. 60 years of careful positioning had placed the sovereignty at the center of that system. Not a monopoly, technically. Just a hub that everything passed through, in the way that a dam is not a river but decides where the river goes. 14 species depended on that hub. Some of them depended on it for 30% of their supply. Some depended on it for 80%. The S-Suvari remnant, a small polity, translucent-skinned, low-gravity adapted, surviving a prior economic collapse, had been importing grain through sovereignty brokerage routes for 22 years. The main confederation traced every transaction they had ever made, and their ledgers showed a pattern of contract asymmetry running across 11 commodities for 19 years, but they had lacked the standing to bring it to anyone who had to listen. The second assumption was that the Galactic Compact was decorative. This was not an unreasonable thing to believe. The Compact had been founded in 2301 as a framework for interspecies trade and diplomatic conduct. The sovereignty had signed it. They had attended 14 tribunal sessions in the following 107 years and had prevailed at every one by the simple method of refusing to comply with any ruling that inconvenienced them. The tribunal had no enforcement mechanism. It had no fleet. It issued rulings the way a librarian issues overdue notices, correctly, officially, and without consequence. The third assumption, and this was the one that mattered, was that the documents they had signed in 2301 had been read by the people who needed to read them and were no longer relevant to anyone. Thurak Ven had presided over 31 denial hearings. He had presided over this gallery, this hall, this floor designed to put foreign petitioners 22 centimeters below him. He had never once been asked to read the clause beneath the clause. 5 hours and 41 minutes after the strike, a woman Orun knew by reputation walked into the Galactic Compact Tribunal filing office on Selen Station and placed a document on the counter. Dr. Sen Kaldrava did not announce herself. She ordered water from the dispensary at the side of the room. She waited for it. A clerk brought it over. She nodded once, set the water on the counter, and slid the filing across. The clerk was a Vorenik, 20 years in the position, a man who had processed 1,400 filings in his career and regarded each one with the patient neutrality of someone who had seen everything. He processed it, he read what it said, he stopped. He read it again. Article 44, subsection 9 of the Galactic Compact, ratified 2301, signed by the sovereignty's own founding council, names legible, seals intact. The text was plain enough. Any compact signatory's public physical assault on a credentialed diplomatic officer of another compact member constituted a Class 1 breach. The consequence was automatic, mandatory 72-hour suspension of all compact clearinghouse credit instruments for the offending party, triggered by filing, not by ruling. The clause had never been used, not once in 107 years. The sovereignty had assumed this meant no one ever would. They had been correct until this morning. The clerk looked up at Kaldrave. "Is this a formal filing?" he asked. "Yes," she said. He stamped it. His hands were steady. Arun would check the timestamp later. The whole exchange took 4 minutes and 9 seconds. The sovereignty's legal liaison contacted the tribunal within 2 hours to object. She cited procedural irregularity. She cited the filing as politically motivated. She cited 3 separate precedents from tribunal sessions in which Class 1 breach claims had been dismissed on jurisdictional grounds. Caldrova had already filed under 3 procedural frameworks simultaneously. 2 of the frameworks were Vethal-authored. The legal liaison's objections applied to one framework, the other 2 stood. At hour 7, the second piece of the operation moved. Agent Sauvain Rail had spent 11 years in the Sovereignty's Administrative Records Division, and in 11 years she had never once accessed a classified file. She had not needed to. What she had done was read everything that was not classified, which in a bureaucracy as large and old as the Sovereignty's was in practice, most of the things that mattered. And she had noted over a period of years that the Sovereignty's archival system used a tagging convention that had been standardized in 2309 and never updated. Records created before 2309 were filed under the old convention. Records created after 2309 that referenced old material were sometimes cross-tagged and sometimes not, depending on who had done the filing. The Sovereignty had left an enormous amount of very relevant information misfiled under a wrong century tag, and had assumed no one would ever sort it because the sorting would take years, and no one had years to spend on a records system they had not been hired to examine. Rail had years, she had 11 of them. The documentation package she released at hour 7 was 847 pages. It covered systematic food brokerage overcharging across 9 smaller species, not fraud in any definition the Sovereignty used, but structured contract asymmetry so consistent, across so many commodities over so many years that it described a policy. The Suvari remnant had been overpaying for grain brokerage by 34% for 22 years. The main confederation had 19 years of documentation showing the same structure across 11 commodities. Neither of them had ever had anyone willing to verify their own records against the Sovereignty's internal ledgers, until Rail cross-filed both archives on the same morning. The package was transmitted to all 9 affected species simultaneously. The Sovereignty's monitoring systems flagged an outgoing data transfer from Rail's workstation. The flag went to an inbox. The inbox belonged to a supervisor who had been on administrative leave for 3 weeks. It would sit there for 6 days before anyone checked it. By then, it would not matter. 9 species received the archive at the same hour. None of them had been told the others were getting it. Orun learned this detail 3 days later from Farathkal's operational notes. The simultaneous transmission had been deliberate. Rail had timed the release so that each species would see the documentation and then, within hours, learn that 8 others had seen the same thing. No one had to be persuaded they were not alone. The proof arrived before the question could be asked. The Suvari remnant responded first. Their governing council met within 4 hours of receiving the package. They were tall people, translucent-skinned, built for low gravity, and they had been living in the shadow of the prior Sovereignty economic collapse for a generation. Orun did not know what was said in that meeting. What she knew was the outcome. At hour 9, the Suvari filed a withdrawal of trade consent document with the Compact Tribunal. Their reasoning was stated in one paragraph. The documentation Rail had released confirmed 22 years of what they had suspected. They had no leverage alone. The filing changed that. The main confederation signed at hour 14. They attached their own 19-year ledger comparison as supplementary evidence, 312 pages, cross-referenced against the Rail package, showing the same structural overcharge across 11 commodities. The main were compact, dense-boned, rust-colored, and culturally incapable of accepting an imbalanced ledger. They had been trying to document this for 2 decades. They had simply lacked anyone willing to hold the other end of the scale. Now they did. While the Suvari and the main were filing, Sergeant Junko Farathkal was on Reach Station 7. The Dohali pastoral residency there was not large. It occupied 2 connected modules near the station's agricultural ring, a practical choice for a pastoralist species that made all its decisions by full herd consensus and preferred to be near growing things while doing it. The corridors smelled of something dry and warm, like hay, but not quite. Farathkal had been there 3 times before, building trust across 3 years, because Marshakafer's brief had been very specific about the Tilhari and the kind of preparation that would be needed. Elder Suriam was 143 years old. She was a slight woman, amber-toned skin, secondary thumbs on each hand, the quiet, settled manner of someone who had been paying attention for a very long time and had learned that the world did not hurry for anyone. She had spent decades studying human history in private, not officially. Just reading the way a person reads when something interests them more than they expected. Farathkal sat across from her and explained what had been built. The full architecture, 19 years of it, not the outcome, the structure, the clause, the archive, the team, the reason. Suriam listened without interrupting. This was a Tilhari habit. They did not interrupt because they were processing, and they did not want to stop processing before the other person had finished speaking. When Farathkal was done, Suriam sat without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "You have been bleeding for 19 years and never once stopped drawing the map." She signed the withdrawal of trade consent document. Her pen moved in one clean stroke. She set it down. Then she looked up at Farathkal and asked if there was anything warm to drink. Tamaz Vale was waiting in the corridor. He had a small kit of personal supplies because Marshakafer's brief had noted, this was the sort of thing the brief noted, that the Tilhari regarded the sharing of warm drinks as a gesture of intent rather than courtesy. He came in and made instant coffee from a packet he had been carrying for 2 months. He handed the cup to Suriam. She wrapped both hands around it. Not a formal gesture, not a cultural performance. Just the instinct of a cold person holding something warm, the same way anyone did, the same way a demiren held the cracked blue mug in the galley of the Caravel Meridian when the world had been terrible to her. Suriam called her counsel from the corridor outside. Orun, reading Farathkal's notes later, pressed her secondary thumb against her robe seam without thinking about it. She pressed it for the second time and held it there, and thought about 143 years of watching the powerful ignore the small, and the small deciding quietly that this was the year they stopped letting that work. The Varric mining band signed at hour 19. They were stocky, heat-adapted, stateless in the traditional sense. They carried their governance aboard their fleet, moved between extraction sites, owned no permanent world. The sovereignty had dismissed them as a non-factor for 40 years. The filing they submitted contained no statement of grievance and no explanation. One document, one signature, one line of text. See attached 31 years of pricing correspondence. The attachment was 480 pages. They had been keeping records longer than anyone had asked them to. This was the mid-collapse safety RE hook, and Orun knew it even as she was watching it happen. Because what she was seeing was not 7 species making independent decisions. What she was seeing was a structure that had been designed to look like 7 species making independent decisions, while actually being one decision made 19 years earlier by an old woman writing on paper in a room on Luna. And the sovereignty had no idea. More than that, the species filing these documents were individually too small to threaten anything. The S-Suvari needed external life support. The Main had no galactic standing to litigate. The Varric had no homeworld. The Tilhari had no military capacity at all. Every single one of them looked at alone was exactly what the sovereignty had always assumed: too small to matter, too weak to act, too scattered to count. The question Orun found herself asking at the 22,000 character mark of what would become her official record was this: what else had long patience reached that no one had yet catalogued? The unnamed 7th species would answer that question in 9 hours. For now, there were still 4 more signatories to come. The Dohali Pastoral Union reached full herd consensus at hour 27. This was fast for the Dohali. Consensus required that every member of the decision body agree, not simply a majority. The manipulation of food systems was, in their culture, a category of harm distinct from any other, not because food was precious, everything was precious, but because food was the precondition for all the other things that could be precious. To manipulate food was to reach into the mouth of every person who ate and decide whether they got to continue. Their statement attached to the filing was 3 paragraphs. The final line read, "We will not overlook this category of harm regardless of what it costs us." They meant it. The Dohali, once they had reached consensus, did not renegotiate. The Choisevel Archipelago states filed at hour 29. They were amphibious, iridescent, 8-limbed, and built for distributed thinking in the way that a reef is built. No single center, no single decision point, 340 individual nodes that could act as one when they chose to. The tribunal clerk spent 45 minutes confirming that a filing signed by 340 entities could constitute a single unified instrument. It was the first time anyone had thought to check. The Choisevel's food processing capacity handled 40% of the secondary protein network that the sovereignty used to fill gaps in its primary brokerage supply. This was not a fact the sovereignty had considered important. They had never considered the Choisevel important. They were distributed, fragmented, impossible to point a threat at. What the sovereignty had missed was that a distributed entity is also impossible to break in the way you break a single thing. At hour 31, a filing arrived from a species that Earth's own archives had listed as uncontactable. No statement, no cover letter, no contact details. Just the document, correctly formatted with the clause cited accurately and the signature line filled in a script Orun had to look up to identify. She looked it up. She found the species. A small polity, 9 inhabited systems, so marginal that the most recent compact census had simply marked them with a question mark and moved on. They had no seat. They had no standing. They had apparently read the documentation that Rail had released and decided that this was the moment to become the kind of entity that sent documents to tribunals. Orun pressed nothing, she simply sat with it. 7 species, 41 combined systems. No military capacity among them. No fleet, no weapons, no single point of leverage that the sovereignty would have recognized as a threat. Together, they were 63% of everything the Vethal sovereignty needed to survive the next fiscal quarter. None of them had ever been considered worth tracking individually. That was the sovereignty's last administrative error, not the ritual strike, not the denial, not the 31 hearings or the 60 years of architectural dominance. The last error was the one they had been making every day for decades, quietly in the background, while they watched the powerful and ignored the small. Kaldrava had filed the clause, Rail had built the archive, Suriam had called her council. At 72 hours, the ruling activated. The Compact Tribunal did not issue a dramatic declaration. It sent a standard administrative notice to 11 clearinghouses. The notice cited Article 44, subsection 9. The clearinghouses processed it. Vethal credit instruments suspended. The sovereignty's food supply chain began fracturing within 6 hours. The brokerage routes the sovereignty controlled ran through the Varric transit lanes. The protein processing went through the Choicevel. The grain came from Dohali-adjacent systems that had now withdrawn consent. 3 of the client species the sovereignty had held through debt and dependency opened back-channel conversations with Earth Strategic Command within 48 hours. They did not publicly commit. They simply stopped waiting to see which way this would go. Dirac Ven went before the tribunal. He was, at that moment, the most powerful individual in the room. He had the full apparatus of the Vethal sovereignty behind him. 60 years of institutional dominance, 9 jurists who had worked for 14 hours, and the complete certainty that procedural power was permanent because it had always been permanent, and there was no reason to believe otherwise. He entered the tribunal annex at Selen's station, and the room had 43 people in it and one face-down document on a table. Orun was in the observer gallery, 3rd row. She had arrived 2 hours before the session and had sat without moving. Kaldrava was already at the table when Thurak Ven entered. She did not stand. She had a glass of water, a stylus she was not using, and the document face down in front of her. One document. The asymmetry of it, 9 jurists, 1 page, was the wrong detail that had been in the room since the beginning, and nobody on the sovereignty side had thought to ask about it. Thurak Ven's subsonic voice register filled the space before he spoke. Orun felt it in her inner ear, not painful, just present, a frequency the Vethal had developed over generations and had learned to use as a reminder of who the room belonged to. Kaldrava picked up the stylus. She set it down again. She was not going to use it. She never had been. Thurak Ven presented the objection. It was thorough. It was legally detailed. Procedural irregularity, jurisdictional overreach, selective application, 3 frameworks. Each one argued with the kind of precision that 9 jurists could produce in 14 hours when they believed they were right. He spoke for 22 minutes. Kaldrava let him finish. She did not check her notes. She did not lean toward her colleagues. When the room went quiet, she sat for one moment and then she reached forward and turned the document over. No weapons, no fleet, no demand, 1 page. It was the original Galactic Compact signature page, dated 2301. The founding council of the Vethal sovereignty, their names, their seals, their marks at the bottom of the column that ran down to Article 44, subsection 9. Kaldrava said nothing for 7 seconds. Orun counted. She pressed her left secondary thumb against the seam of her robe for the 3rd and final time. Then Kaldrava said, "You built the room. We simply learned where the walls were load-bearing." Thurak Ven's secondary eyelids closed, horizontal, slow, the way they did under stress. It was the only visible reaction he produced. He did not respond. He did not argue. He stood for a moment in a room that had, in the space of 7 seconds and 1 sentence, become a different kind of room than the one he had entered. Then he sat down. The tribunal ruled in 9 hours and 14 minutes. The terms were as follows: a formal compact apology for the ritual strike on a credentialed diplomatic officer. Full restoration of Commander General Ademiren's diplomatic standing and all associated petition rights. Unconditional opening of the Kepler corridor. A 3-year compact financial audit of all sovereignty brokerage operations. Thurak Ven was removed from the convener chair by his own colleagues before the ruling was formally transmitted. There was no ceremony. His colleagues simply voted and then they told him, and then he left. He walked out of the Sovereignty Council chamber under his own power. No guards escorted him. The door closed behind him. On Luna, in a quiet room, Ambassador retired Sen Marshakafer read the ruling summary and set it down. She sat for a while, then she opened a new file. She had no name for it yet. She was 70 years old. She had time. Ademiran came back to Earth 12 days later. No arrival ceremony. She took a civilian transport from the orbital dock to the city. She carried one bag. The cracked blue mug was in it, wrapped in a shirt, the way you wrap something that has survived a long time and you would like it to keep surviving. The auditorium was small, a government building on the south side of the city. Nothing marked on the outside except the building number. 200 people. No cameras, no broadcast rights, no journalists in the seats. The only recording was the official one, running on a single fixed unit at the back of the room, the kind that sat in an archive for decades and was occasionally retrieved. A reader stood at the front. The names of the 14,000 Haveth supply denial dead were read aloud in order from a printed list. All of them, one by one. It took 4 hours and 9 minutes. Ambassador retired Sen Marshakafer stood for the entire reading. She was 70 years old, her back hurt. At the 3-hour mark, a young aide came and stood beside her holding a folding chair, not pushing it, just holding it nearby. Marshakafer shook her head once, very slightly, and kept her eyes on the reader. She did not look away. Ademiran stood at the back of the room, near the wall. Her daughter stood beside her. They did not speak. There was nothing to say during the reading, and both of them understood this without discussing it. Her daughter was holding her own hands together in front of her, fingers locked, the way she had done as a child before difficult things, a habit Ademiran had watched develop over years and had never commented on, because some habits are not for commenting on. The names went on. The reader did not rush. Each name was given the same duration, the same weight. The room was quiet enough that Arun, seated in the second row, could hear the ventilation system cycling and the occasional sound of someone in the back pressing their hand over their mouth. At the 4-hour mark, Arun stopped taking notes. She put her pen down. She pressed nothing. She simply listened. The last name was called. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before, not the quiet of waiting, but the quiet of completion, which is its own kind of sound. Ademiran reached into her jacket pocket. She took out the cracked blue mug. She turned it in both hands, the text facing inward the way she always kept it, and she found the crack under her left thumb, the same way, exactly the same pressure, the same small ridge of slightly rough glaze where the base had not quite fused. Her daughter had made it wrong and sent it anyway. She had fired it in a school kiln, gotten the temperature a little off, seen the crack form in the base and sent it regardless, because she was 12 and she had made it for her mother and the crack did not change what it was. Ademiran had carried it because the wrongness was the thing, not fixed, not perfect, just present, still whole enough to hold something warm in the rooms where the world was being terrible, and that had been the truest argument in every room she had ever sat in. A young lieutenant came over after the room emptied out. He had been stationed at the door as ceremonial detail and had been crying quietly for the better part of the last hour. He had the specific expression of someone who had come in not fully understanding what he was attending and had understood it entirely by the end. He asked what the lesson was. She looked at the mug, then at him. "Patience is not the absence of fury," she said. "It is fury that learned to draw a blueprint." She put the mug back in her pocket. She thanked him for attending. She walked toward the door. Her daughter fell into step beside her. The door closed.